This was deliberate endangerment, systematic harassment, and the kind of toxic leadership that could destroy not just individuals but entire units. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Commander Hayes. "Status report?" Sarah typed back quickly. "Situation worse than reported. Recommend immediate intervention." But even as she sent the message, she knew that her mission was far from over. What she had witnessed today was just the tip of the iceberg. To build a case that would result in real change, she needed more evidence, more documentation, and a deeper understanding of just how far the corruption had spread. As the sun set over Coronado that evening, Sarah Mitchell sat in her temporary quarters reviewing her notes from the day. 24 pages of observations, timing data, and direct quotes that painted a picture of a training program that had lost its way. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to observe and document. And somewhere in the base hospital, a young SEAL candidate named Johnson was recovering from an incident that should never have happened. Sarah closed her notebook and prepared for another day in a world where the line between legitimate military training and systematic abuse had become dangerously blurred. She had no idea that within 48 hours, her carefully maintained cover would be blown and she would find herself in a situation that would test every skill she had learned in her 12 years of naval special warfare. The real test was just beginning. Sarah arrived at the training compound before dawn the next morning, her mind focused on the day ahead. Johnson's near-drowning incident had been officially classified as a training accident, but she knew better. The pattern of targeting specific candidates was becoming impossible to ignore, and she suspected that yesterday's evolution had been deliberately designed to push the young SEAL beyond his limits. The base hospital had released Johnson that evening with a clean bill of health, but Sarah had made a point of visiting him during her off hours. What she found was a young man whose spirit had been systematically broken down over weeks of targeted harassment. "I don't understand what I'm doing wrong, Doc," Johnson had told her, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm hitting all my times. My scores are in the top 10%, but nothing I do seems to be good enough for them." Sarah had listened without revealing her true identity, offering the kind of generic encouragement she might provide as a civilian researcher. But inside, her anger was building. This wasn't training. This was psychological warfare being waged against promising young warriors by the very people who were supposed to be preparing them for success. Now, as she made her way across the dark training ground toward her observation post, she noticed something different in the atmosphere. There were more instructors present than usual, and they seemed to be gathering in small groups, their voices low and their body language tense. Lieutenant Commander Morrison appeared from the direction of the administrative building, walking with purpose toward where Senior Chief Webb and the other instructors were clustered near the obstacle course. Sarah positioned herself where she could observe their interaction, while appearing to be setting up her equipment for the day's observations. She adjusted her binoculars and pretended to be studying her notes while straining to hear fragments of their conversation. "Researcher asking too many questions." Morrison's voice carried on the morning breeze. "Saw her timing the exercises yesterday." That was Webb's gravelly voice. "Need to be more careful about what she sees." Torres chimed in. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool morning air. Her cover might be intact, but they were clearly suspicious of her activities. She would need to be even more careful about how she conducted her observations. The morning evolution began with navigation training. Candidates were required to move through a complex obstacle course while maintaining precise compass bearings and hitting specific checkpoints within strict time limits. It was designed to simulate the kind of precision movement required during actual combat operations. Sarah watched as the first group of candidates moved through the course. The exercise appeared to be conducted fairly, with instructors providing helpful guidance and measuring performance against published standards. But she noticed that Johnson and two other candidates who had been consistently targeted were assigned to the second group, scheduled to run the course after a 30-minute break. During that break, Sarah observed something that made her stomach clench with anger. While the first group was being debriefed, she watched through her binoculars as Torres and another instructor made subtle adjustments to several of the obstacles in the course. They moved markers, adjusted rope tensions, and modified equipment in ways that would make successful completion significantly more difficult. When the second group began their evolution, the results were predictable. 3 candidates, including Johnson, failed to complete the course within the time limit. But what the instructors didn't know was that Sarah had been documenting everything, including the unauthorized modifications to the equipment. "Looks like we've got some candidates who aren't quite ready for prime time," Webb announced loudly as the second group finished their attempt. "Johnson, Martinez, Williams, you 3 will repeat this evolution after lunch." and maybe this time you'll take it seriously enough to actually succeed. Sarah made detailed notes, including precise times and descriptions of the equipment modifications she had observed. The evidence was mounting, but she knew she needed more than just documentation of isolated incidents. She needed to understand the full scope of the problem and identify all the personnel involved. After the morning training ended, Sarah decided to conduct some informal interviews with candidates during their lunch break. She positioned herself in the chow hall, where she could engage in casual conversation without appearing to be conducting formal research. The first several candidates she spoke with were clearly reluctant to say anything negative about their training or instructors. Their responses were professional but guarded, and Sarah could sense the fear underneath their carefully neutral words. But then she encountered Petty Officer Second Class Maria Santos, a female candidate who was one of only 2 women in the current class. Santos had been performing exceptionally well in all evolutions, consistently scoring in the top 5% of candidates. But Sarah had noticed that she, too, was beginning to receive disproportionate attention from the instructors. "How are you finding the training so far?" Sarah asked casually as Santos sat down with her lunch tray. Santos glanced around the chow hall before answering. "It's challenging, ma'am, but that's what we expected coming in. I've been observing for a few days now. You seem to be doing very well. Top performer in most evolutions." A shadow crossed Santos's face. "Performance is only part of it, Doc. There are other factors that go into who makes it through the program. Indecision. Let's just say that some people have to work harder than others to prove they belong here. 'Cause you're a woman? That's part of it, but it's more complicated than that. There's a whole system here, unwritten rules about who gets protected and who gets targeted. And if you end up on the wrong side of that system," Santos trailed off as Senior Chief Webb entered the chow hall. The change in her demeanor was immediate and dramatic. She straightened up, her expression becoming carefully neutral. "I should get going, ma'am. Thank you for your time." As Santos hurried away, Sarah made notes about their conversation. The picture that was emerging was of a training program that had been compromised by personal prejudices and unofficial hierarchies that had nothing to do with actual performance or potential. That afternoon brought combat skills training, and Sarah positioned herself where she could observe both the candidates and the instructors. The evolution involved close-quarters combat techniques, with candidates paired off to practice various fighting skills under instructor supervision. What she witnessed over the next 2 hours was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Johnson was paired with Rodriguez, one of the strongest and most skilled candidates in the class. Under normal circumstances, this would have been a valuable learning experience for Johnson, with Rodriguez helping to improve his techniques. Instead, Sarah watched as Torres quietly spoke to Rodriguez before the evolution began. She couldn't hear the conversation, but the body language was clear. Torres was giving Rodriguez specific instructions about how to handle his training partner. When the combat training began, Rodriguez systematically dominated Johnson in every exchange. But it wasn't the kind of controlled, educational dominance that good training partners provided. This was aggressive, brutal, and designed to inflict maximum physical and psychological damage. Johnson was thrown repeatedly, choked unconscious twice, and subjected to joint locks that were applied with unnecessary force. Each time he tapped out, Torres would criticize his performance and demand that he try harder. "Come on, Johnson! Is this the best you can do?" "Rodriguez is barely trying, and he's making you look like an amateur." Sarah timed the exercises and compared Johnson's performance to published standards. Despite the one-sided nature of the training, Johnson was actually performing well within acceptable parameters. His techniques were sound, his conditioning was excellent, and his determination was unquestionable. But after an hour of systematic abuse, even Johnson's impressive mental toughness was beginning to crack. Sarah could see the doubt creeping into his movements, the hesitation that came from having his confidence systematically destroyed. When the evolution finally ended, Johnson was battered, exhausted, and clearly demoralized. But it was what happened next that pushed Sarah's anger to the boiling point. As the candidates were dismissed to clean up for the next training period, Torres approached Rodriguez with a satisfied smile. "Good work out there, Rodriguez. Keep that up. And Johnson will be ringing out by the end of the week." Rodriguez looked uncomfortable with the praise. "Senior Chief, maybe we should ease up a little. Johnson's actually pretty good. He just needs some confidence building." Torres's expression darkened. "Are you questioning my training methods, Rodriguez?" "Just suggesting that maybe nothing. You do what I tell you to do when I tell you to do it. And what I'm telling you to do is make sure Johnson understands that he doesn't belong here. Are we clear? Rodriguez nodded reluctantly, but Sarah could see the conflict in his eyes. He was a good man being forced to participate in the systematic destruction of a fellow warrior. That evening, Sarah called Commander Hayes from her quarters to provide an update on her investigation. Hayes. Ma'am, it's Mitchell. I need to brief you on what I've observed so far. Go ahead. Sarah spent the next 30 minutes detailing her findings. Huh? The equipment sabotage, the inconsistent application of standards, the deliberate targeting of specific candidates, and the near-drowning incident that could have resulted in a fatality. Jesus, Sarah, this is worse than we thought. How widespread is it? From what I can tell, it involves most of the training cadre. Morrison is either directly involved or he's willfully ignorant of what's happening under his command. Either way, he's failed in his leadership responsibilities. What's your assessment of the candidates who are being targeted? Sarah consulted her notes. High performers. All of them. Johnson is scoring in the top 15% of his class despite the constant harassment. Santos is arguably the best candidate they have. The others being targeted are also well above average. So this isn't about maintaining standards. No, ma'am. This is about something else entirely. Personal prejudices, power games, maybe even some kind of sadistic enjoyment of breaking down good people. Hayes was quiet for several moments. Sarah, I need you to be extremely careful. If they suspect you're more than just a researcher, I understand, ma'am. But I need more time to build a complete case. What I have so far is damaging, but I need to understand the full scope of the problem. How much more time do you need? Maybe a week. 2 at the outside. All right. But at the first sign that your cover is blown, you extract immediately. I don't care about the investigation. Your safety is the priority. Understood. After ending the call, Sarah spent the rest of the evening reviewing her notes and planning her approach for the following days. She needed to find a way to document the systematic nature of the abuse while protecting her identity as an evaluator. But as she prepared for bed, she had no idea that her carefully maintained cover was about to be shattered by an unexpected encounter that would change everything. The next morning dawned grey and overcast, with a marine layer that reduced visibility across the training ground. Sarah arrived at her usual time, but something felt different. The normal bustle of activity was replaced by an eerie quiet, and there were fewer personnel visible than usual. She made her way to her observation post and began setting up her equipment. But she noticed that several instructors were watching her more closely than they had in previous days. Their attention felt different somehow, more focused and predatory. The morning evolution was scheduled to be underwater demolition training, one of the most dangerous exercises in the SEAL program. Candidates would be working with actual explosives while submerged, requiring absolute precision and flawless safety protocols. Sarah positioned herself where she could observe the safety procedures and document any violations. Given what had happened to Johnson 2 days earlier, she was particularly concerned about how this high-risk evolution would be conducted. But as the candidates gathered for their pre-exercise briefing, Sarah noticed that Johnson, Santos, and 2 other targeted candidates were not present. "Excuse me," she called to Petty Officer Torres, who was walking past her observation area. "Where are the other candidates?" "I count only 18 instead of 20. 4. Torres's smile was cold and predatory. "Oh, those 4 are participating in a special evolution today." Senior Chief Webb thought they needed some additional training to bring them up to the standard of the rest of the class. Sarah felt alarm bells going off in her head. What kind of special training? Combat scenario. They're being deployed to the remote training area for a 72-hour field exercise. Really test their skills under pressure. Sarah knew the remote training area. It was a section of wilderness about 20 miles from the main base, used for advanced combat training and survival exercises. It was also completely isolated, with no external oversight or observation. "That's interesting," she said carefully. "I'd like to observe that evolution as well. Would it be possible for me to—" "Sorry, Doc. That area is off-limits to civilian personnel. Safety regulations." Torres walked away before Sarah could ask any more questions, leaving her with a growing sense of dread. 4 candidates who had been systematically targeted were now isolated in a remote location with the same instructors who had been abusing them. The possibilities for what could happen were terrifying. She tried to maintain her cover and continue observing the underwater demolition training, but her mind kept returning to Johnson and the others. If her suspicions were correct, they were in serious danger. The demolition exercise proceeded without incident, but Sarah barely paid attention. She was formulating plans, considering options, trying to figure out how she could help the isolated candidates without blowing her cover completely. But her planning was interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind her. She turned to find Lieutenant Commander Morrison approaching, flanked by Senior Chief Webb and two other instructors she didn't recognize. "Dr. Mitchell," Morrison said, his voice carrying a tone she hadn't heard before, "could we have a word with you? There are some questions about your research that need to be clarified." Sarah felt her pulse quicken, but she maintained her professional demeanor. "Of course, Commander. What can I help you with? Perhaps we could speak somewhere more private." "Conference room B?" Sarah nodded and gathered her equipment, but as she stood up, she noticed that the instructors had positioned themselves in a way that effectively surrounded her. This wasn't a friendly request for clarification. This was something else entirely. As they walked toward the administrative building, Sarah's mind raced through her options. Her cover might be blown, but she still had her credentials and her authority as a SEAL evaluator. The question was whether Morrison and his subordinates would respect that authority, or whether they had crossed a line that put them beyond the reach of normal military discipline. Conference room B felt different this time. The blinds were closed, the door was shut, and there was an air of confrontation that hadn't been present during her initial meeting with Morrison. "Dr. Mitchell," Morrison began, "we've been reviewing your credentials and your research proposal, and we have some concerns." Sarah kept her expression neutral. "What kind of concerns, Commander?" Webb stepped forward, a folder in his hands. "We did some checking with the Pentagon. Turns out there's no record of any psychology research project involving SEAL training protocols. When your cover is blown, maintain it as long as possible while preparing for alternative actions. That's unusual. Perhaps there was a miscommunication somewhere in the approval process. Or perhaps," Morrison said quietly, "you're not who you claim to be." The silence in the room was deafening. Sarah could feel the weight of their collective stare, the predatory attention of men who believed they had cornered their prey. "I'm not sure what you're implying, Commander." Webb opened the folder and pulled out a photograph. "This was taken at the Naval War College 3 years ago. Graduation ceremony for the Advanced Military Psychology program." He slid the photograph across the table. Sarah looked down and felt her heart sink. It was a group photo of her graduating class, and she was clearly visible in the front row, wearing her dress uniform with her rank insignia clearly displayed. "Commander Sarah Mitchell," Morrison read from a document in the folder. "Naval Special Warfare Evaluator, attached to Naval Special Warfare Command. 12 years of active duty, multiple combat deployments, and specialized training in covert assessment operations." Sarah looked up from the photograph, her mind racing through options and contingencies. Her cover was completely blown, but that didn't necessarily mean she was in immediate danger. These men were still active-duty military personnel, and she outranked most of them. "Gentlemen," she said quietly, allowing her voice to carry the authority of command for the first time since arriving at Coronado. "I think we need to have a different conversation." The atmosphere in the room shifted immediately. Morrison and his subordinates had been expecting denials, panic, maybe even fear. Instead, they found themselves facing a naval special warfare officer whose credentials and authority were impeccable. But what happened next would test every skill Sarah had learned in her 12 years of military service and determine whether her investigation would result in justice or tragedy. The silence in conference room B stretched for what felt like an eternity. Sarah could see the calculations running behind Morrison's eyes as he processed the implications of her true identity. Webb's face had gone pale, and the two other instructors shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. "Commander Mitchell," Morrison finally said, his voice carefully controlled, "this is an unexpected development." Sarah leaned back in her chair, allowing herself to project the calm confidence that came with knowing she held the superior position. "I imagine it is, Lieutenant Commander. The question now is how we proceed from here." Webb found his voice first. "Ma'am, if we had known your true identity, you would have what, Senior Chief? Conducted yourselves differently? Put on a show for the brass while continuing to abuse candidates behind closed doors?" The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Morrison's jaw tightened, but he seemed to be measuring his words carefully. "Commander, I think there may be some misunderstanding about the nature of our training program. We maintain the higher standards because..." "Because what?" Sarah interrupted, opening her notebook and consulting her detailed observations. "Because nearly drowning a candidate teaches him discipline? Because sabotaging equipment builds character? Because targeting high-performing candidates with systematic harassment prepares them for combat?" She could see the shock in their faces as they realized just how much she had observed and documented. These men had become so comfortable with their corrupt practices that they had forgotten the first rule of military misconduct: always assume someone is watching. Morrison leaned forward, his expression hardening. Commander, I don't appreciate your tone or your implications. This training program has produced some of the finest warriors in naval special warfare. Let's talk about attrition rates, Lieutenant Commander. Let's discuss the number of high-quality candidates who have washed out of your program not due to lack of ability, but because they couldn't endure the systematic abuse you've institutionalized here. Sarah pulled out a separate set of notes she had prepared for this moment. Over the past 18 months, your program has had a 37% higher attrition rate than the SEAL training average. But here's the interesting part. When I cross-referenced the candidates who washed out with their performance data, I found that 62% of them were scoring in the top half of their classes when they quit. Webb shifted uncomfortably. Sometimes good candidates just don't have the mental toughness. Mental toughness? Sarah's voice carried the steel of command authority now. Senior Chief, I've reviewed the psychological profiles of every candidate who has quit your program in the past year. These are not weak individuals. These are warriors who are systematically broken down by instructors who confuse sadism with training. Morrison stood up abruptly, his face flushed with anger. Commander, I don't know what kind of agenda you're pursuing here, but I will not sit here and listen to you malign the reputation of this program and my instructors. Sarah remained seated, projecting calm control. Sit down, Lieutenant Commander. We're not finished. The command in her voice was unmistakable. Morrison hesitated for a moment, clearly torn between his anger and his recognition of her superior rank and authority. After a tense pause, he slowly sank back into his chair. Now, Sarah continued, let's talk about Johnson, Santos, Martinez, and Williams. Where exactly are they, and what kind of special training are they receiving? Webb's face went ashen. Ma'am, they're participating in a routine field exercise. Don't lie to me, Senior Chief. I know those 4 candidates have been specifically targeted by your training cadre. I've documented weeks of systematic harassment, impossible standards, and deliberate sabotage. Now they've been isolated in a remote location with no oversight or observation. So I'll ask you again, what exactly is happening to them? Morrison and Webb exchanged glances, and Sarah could see the fear starting to creep into their expressions. They were beginning to realize that their carefully constructed system of abuse was about to come crashing down around them. Commander, Morrison said, his voice now carrying a note of desperation. Perhaps there's been some miscommunication about training methods. If you have concerns about specific procedures, I'm sure we can address them through proper channels. Sarah smiled coldly. Proper channels? You mean like the complaint system that has mysteriously failed to produce any formal records of the issues I've observed? The same system that allowed a candidate to nearly drown under your watch because a safety supervisor was more interested in casual conversation than in doing his job? She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the training ground, where this morning's candidates were cleaning equipment after their demolition exercise. When she spoke again, her voice was quiet but carried the weight of absolute authority. Gentlemen, I want those 4 candidates back on this base within 2 hours. I want a complete accounting of their treatment during the special exercise, and I want a full roster of all personnel who have participated in or been aware of the systematic abuse that has been occurring in this program. Morrison's face had gone red with anger and fear. Commander, you're making serious allegations without any real evidence. The word of a single investigator against the testimony of multiple decorated instructors. Multiple decorated instructors who are about to face courts-martial for conduct unbecoming, dereliction of duty, and criminal assault. Sarah interrupted. And I won't be the only one testifying against you. Rodriguez contacted me this morning. It seems your pressure to make him abuse Johnson finally pushed him too far. He's prepared to testify about the instructions you gave him to deliberately injure a fellow candidate. Webb's face crumpled as he realized the scope of what was unfolding. Commander, please. I have 18 years in the Navy. A wife and kids. If this goes to court-martial, you should have thought about that before you decided to torture the men you were supposed to be training. Sarah replied without sympathy. Morrison stood up again, but this time his demeanor was different. The bluster and authority were gone, replaced by something that looked almost dangerous. Commander Mitchell, he said quietly, I think you may be overestimating your position here. You're one person, operating alone, in a place where accidents happen during training exercises. The threat was unmistakable, and Sarah felt her training kick into high gear. These men had crossed so many lines that threatening a superior officer was just one more step into the abyss. Lieutenant Commander, she said calmly, are you threatening me? I'm simply pointing out the realities of the situation. You've spent the last week documenting what you believe to be improper training methods. But training accidents are common in high-risk programs like this one. Equipment failures, human error, the kind of tragic mishaps that end careers and lives. Sarah pulled out her phone and held it up so they could see the screen. This conversation has been recorded and automatically uploaded to Naval Special Warfare Command. So have all of my daily reports, photographs, and documentation. If anything happens to me, or to those 4 candidates you have isolated, there will be no way to cover it up. The color drained from Morrison's face as he realized the trap he had walked into. By threatening her, he had provided the final piece of evidence needed to destroy not just his career, but potentially his freedom. But Sarah wasn't finished. There's something else you should know. Commander Hayes didn't send me here alone. There are federal agents positioned around this facility, and they've been monitoring all communications in and out of this base for the past week. It was a bluff, but a convincing one. Morrison and his subordinates had no way of knowing whether it was true, and their guilty consciences filled in the blanks with their worst fears. Webb broke first. Commander, please. I'll cooperate fully. I'll tell you everything you want to know. Just please don't destroy my career over this. Your career was destroyed the moment you decided to abuse the men you were supposed to be training, Senior Chief. The only question now is whether you'll face administrative punishment or criminal charges. Morrison sank back into his chair, the fight going out of him like air from a punctured balloon. What do you want from us? Sarah sat back down and opened her notebook to a fresh page. I want the truth, all of it. I want to know how the system of abuse started, who's involved, and what's happened to every candidate who has been targeted. For the next 3 hours, Sarah conducted what amounted to a formal interrogation. Morrison and Webb, faced with overwhelming evidence and the collapse of their ability to cover up their crimes, began to provide details about a system of corruption that was far worse than even Sarah had suspected. The abuse wasn't random or opportunistic. It was systematic, organized, and designed to weed out candidates who didn't fit the instructor's personal prejudices. Women, minorities, and anyone who showed independence of thought were targeted for elimination. We called it culling the herd, Webb admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Morrison said we needed to maintain certain standards, certain types of candidates. What types? Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Morrison remained silent, but Webb continued talking, apparently desperate to minimize his own culpability by implicating his superior. He said the teams were changing too much, becoming too diverse. That we needed to make sure the right kind of people made it through the program. Sarah felt sick to her stomach as the full scope of the discrimination was revealed. This wasn't just poor training or excessive standards. This was systematic bigotry masquerading as military discipline. And the candidates who are in the field right now? Morrison finally spoke, his voice hollow with defeat. They're fine. It's just a standard field exercise. We thought if we could get them away from your observation for a few days, we could convince you that they were problem candidates who couldn't handle the pressure. Sarah pulled out her phone and dialed a number. When it connected, she spoke with the crisp authority of command. This is Commander Mitchell. I need an immediate extraction team dispatched to grid coordinates 347.891 by 127.456. 4. Personnel require immediate medical and psychological evaluation. Hostile environment. Approach with caution. She ended the call and looked at the broken men across the table from her. The extraction team will bring them back safely. And then we're going to have a conversation about every single candidate who has been victimized by your system. Over the next several days, Sarah's investigation expanded to encompass not just the training cadre at Coronado, but a network of corrupt instructors and commanders throughout the naval special warfare community. The evidence she had gathered became the foundation for the largest investigation in the history of the SEAL program. Johnson, Santos, Martinez, and Williams were found exactly where Morrison had said they would be, participating in what was indeed a standard field exercise. But psychological evaluation revealed the psychological trauma they had endured during weeks of systematic harassment. Rodriguez kept his promise to testify, providing details about the instructions he had been given to deliberately injure fellow candidates. His testimony opened the floodgates as other candidates and even some instructors came forward to report abuses they had witnessed or experienced. The courts-martial that followed was swift and decisive. Morrison was sentenced to 5 years in military prison and dismissed from the service. Webb received 4 years and forfeiture of all pay and benefits. Torres and 6 other instructors received sentences ranging from 2 to 3 years, with all losing their military careers. But the real victory wasn't in the punishment of the guilty. It was in the systematic reform of the training program that followed. new oversight procedures, mandatory reporting requirements, and a complete overhaul of the instructor selection and evaluation process. Johnson went on to graduate from SEAL training with honors and later served with distinction in 3 combat deployments. Santos became the first woman to complete the program in over 2 years and eventually commanded her own special operations unit. 6 months after the investigation concluded, Sarah found herself back at Coronado, this time conducting a follow-up evaluation of the reform training program. As she walked across the same training ground where she had documented so much abuse, she reflected on the lessons she had learned during those difficult weeks undercover. The most dangerous enemy to any military organization isn't external opposition or battlefield challenges. It's the corruption that can grow within the ranks when good people fail to stand up to those who abuse their authority. Standing on the observation deck where she had spent so many hours documenting evidence, Sarah watched a new class of SEAL candidates working through their morning evolution. The instructors were professional, demanding but fair, and focused on building up their students rather than breaking them down. The transformation wasn't perfect, and there was still work to be done. But the systematic abuse that had infected the program was gone, replaced by the kind of tough but fair training that produced real warriors rather than broken victims. As she prepared to leave Coronado for her next assignment, Sarah received a message from Johnson, now Petty Officer First Class Johnson, deployed somewhere in the Middle East. Commander Mitchell, the message read, I wanted you to know that our team conducted a successful mission last week that wouldn't have been possible without the training I received at Coronado. But more importantly, it wouldn't have been possible without your courage to stand up for us when we couldn't stand up for ourselves. Thank you for reminding us all what honor really means. Sarah smiled as she read the message, then deleted it and walked away from the training ground. There would be other assignments, other investigations, other battles to fight against corruption and abuse within the ranks. But for now, she was content knowing that the young warriors training at Coronado would be prepared for the challenges they would face not through systematic abuse, but through the kind of professional, demanding training that built character rather than destroying it. The system had been broken, but it had been fixed. The warriors who graduated would be stronger, not because they had survived abuse, but because they had been trained by professionals who understood the difference between toughness and cruelty. And somewhere in a remote corner of the world, Johnson and his teammates were proving that real warriors are forged through challenge and support, not through systematic destruction of their spirit and confidence. The ambush on the training ground had backfired completely. Instead of intimidating or eliminating an inconvenient observer, Morrison and his subordinates had exposed themselves to an investigator whose skills and authority they had fatally underestimated. The hunters had indeed become the hunted, and justice had finally been served. What happens when the hunters become the hunted? When 20 elite Navy SEALs thought they were proving their dominance over a lone woman on their sacred training ground, they had no idea they were about to face the most humbling lesson of their military careers. This is the true story of Commander Sarah Mitchell, whose identity remained hidden until the moment that changed everything. The morning mist hung low over the Coronado training facility. As Sarah Mitchell adjusted her standard-issue BDUs and checked her watch, 5:30 a.m. sharp, she had arrived exactly 15 minutes before the scheduled evaluation, just as protocol demanded. But this wasn't going to be any ordinary assessment. For the past 6 months, whispers had been circulating through the Naval Special Warfare Command about serious issues within SEAL Team 7's training program. Sarah walked across the compound with measured steps, her boots making soft sounds against the wet asphalt. At 34 years old, she had spent the last 12 years climbing through the ranks of Naval Special Warfare, becoming one of only 3 female SEAL evaluators in the entire program. Her credentials were impeccable. Combat deployments in Afghanistan and Iraq, specialized training in psychological operations, and a master's degree in military psychology from the Naval War College. Yet none of that mattered to the men she was about to evaluate. The complaints had been mounting for months. Yet none of that mattered to the men she was about to evaluate. The complaints had been mounting for months. Reports of hazing that crossed the line from tough training into outright abuse. Incidents of discrimination that went beyond the usual military ribbing. And most concerning of all, a complete breakdown in unit cohesion that had resulted in 3 promising candidates washing out of the program, not due to lack of skill, but because of the toxic environment created by their instructors. Commander Patricia Hayes, Sarah's direct superior, had been clear in her briefing. Mitchell, We need someone who can blend in, observe without being detected, and provide us with an accurate assessment of what's really happening down there. The official channels aren't working. These men close ranks the moment they see brass coming. Sarah had nodded, understanding the delicate nature of her assignment. How long do I have? As long as it takes. Your cover story is solid. You're a psychology researcher from the Pentagon, conducting a study on stress responses in elite military units. They've been told to cooperate fully, but we both know they'll try to put on a show for you. And if they don't buy it? Hayes had smiled grimly. Then we'll find out just how good your training really is. Now, standing at the edge of the training ground, Sarah could see the first group of SEALs beginning their morning PT. Even from a distance, she could sense the tension in the air. These weren't the disciplined, cohesive units she was accustomed to evaluating. There was something different here, something that set her instincts on high alert. She made her way toward the administrative building, where she was supposed to check in with Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison, the training officer who would serve as her liaison. Morrison had a reputation throughout the community. 15 years in the teams, multiple combat deployments, and a record that spoke of exceptional leadership under fire. But recent reports had painted a different picture. Complaints about his methods, about the culture he was fostering, about the way he treated anyone he perceived as an outsider. The administrative building was a simple, functional structure that housed the officers of the training cadre. Sarah pushed through the heavy glass doors and approached the reception desk, where a young petty officer sat typing at a computer. "I'm Dr. Sarah Mitchell," she said, using the cover identity that had been carefully constructed for this mission. "I have an appointment with Lieutenant Commander Morrison." The petty officer looked up, his eyes widening slightly as he took in her appearance. Sarah had deliberately chosen her outfit carefully, professional but not overly formal. Civilian clothes that suggested academic credentials without appearing threatening to the military hierarchy. "Yes, ma'am, the commander is expecting you. Conference room B, down the hall and to your right." Sarah thanked him and made her way down the corridor, her mind already cataloguing details. The walls were lined with photos of graduating SEAL classes, their faces young and determined, but there was something missing from the more recent photos. The sense of brotherhood, of shared purpose, that had always been the hallmark of naval special warfare. She found conference room B and knocked gently on the door. A gruff voice called for her to enter, and she stepped inside to find Lieutenant Commander Morrison standing with his back to her, looking out the window at the training ground beyond. Morrison was exactly what Central Casting would order for a Navy SEAL officer. 6'2" of solid muscle, graying hair cut in a perfect high and tight, and shoulders that looked like they could carry the weight of the world. When he turned to face her, his eyes were the pale blue of Arctic ice, assessing her with the practiced gaze of a predator evaluating potential prey. "Dr. Mitchell," he said, not bothering to extend his hand. "I'll be honest with you. I'm not sure what you think you're going to learn here that we can't tell you in a simple briefing." Sarah smiled professionally. "I appreciate your directness, Commander. The Pentagon is interested in developing new training protocols based on the latest research in stress psychology. Your unit has one of the highest success rates in the program, so naturally, we want to understand what makes you so effective." It wasn't entirely a lie. SEAL Team 7 did have impressive graduation statistics, but what the numbers didn't show was the high rate of attrition after graduation, or the concerning pattern of behavioral issues among graduates that had started to emerge in the fleet. Morrison's expression softened slightly at the praise. "Well, I suppose if it helps improve the program overall, we can accommodate your research." "What exactly do you need from us?" "Just permission to observe. I'll try to stay out of the way, take some notes, maybe conduct a few informal interviews with instructors and candidates. Nothing that will interfere with your training schedule." "Fair enough. But understand this, Doctor. What we do here is serious business. These men are being prepared for combat operations where a moment's hesitation or weakness can get them and their teammates killed. We don't coddle anyone, and we don't apologize for maintaining the highest standards in the military." Sarah nodded. "I wouldn't expect anything less, Commander." Morrison glanced at his watch. "The current class is about to begin their morning evolution, physical fitness assessment followed by combat swimming. You can observe from the bleachers if you want to get a feel for what we do here." 20 minutes later, Sarah found herself sitting on aluminum bleachers overlooking the main training ground, a notebook in her lap and a pair of binoculars around her neck. Below her, 24 SEAL candidates were lined up in perfect formation, awaiting instructions from their training cadre. The lead instructor was Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Webb, a mountain of a man whose voice carried across the training ground like thunder. Sarah had read his file during her preparation. 12 years in the teams, multiple combat deployments, and a reputation as one of the toughest instructors in the program. But his file also contained several formal complaints that had been filed and then mysteriously withdrawn. "Listen up, tadpoles," Webb's voice boomed across the field. "Today's physical fitness assessment will determine whether you have what it takes to continue in this program or whether you'll be ringing that bell and heading home to mummy with your tail between your legs." The candidates responded with a sharp, "Hoo-yah, Senior Chief." Sarah began taking notes, documenting the language used, the tone of the interactions, the body language of both instructors and students. Everything appeared normal on the surface, but she had learned to look beyond the obvious during her years as an evaluator. The PT test began with push-ups, standard military exercise, but Sarah noticed immediately that the standards being applied weren't consistent. Some candidates who appeared to be struggling were allowed to continue, while others who seemed to be performing adequately were called out and forced to start over. "Johnson!" Webb screamed at a young candidate whose form looked perfect to Sarah's trained eye. "What kind of weak-ass push-up was that?" "Drop and give me 50 more." The young man, barely out of his teens, immediately complied without question. But Sarah could see the confusion in his eyes, the uncertainty that came from not understanding what he had done wrong. She made a note in her book: inconsistent application of standards, possible targeting of specific individuals. The PT test continued with sit-ups, pull-ups, and a timed run. Throughout each evolution, Sarah observed the same pattern. Certain candidates seemed to be held to impossible standards, while others were given passes on form and technique that should have resulted in failures. After 2 hours of observation, Sarah had filled several pages with notes. The picture that was emerging was troubling, but she needed more information before she could draw any definitive conclusions. During a break in the training, she decided to walk around the compound to get a better feel for the environment. The SEAL training facility at Coronado was legendary throughout the military. It was here that the toughest warriors in the American Armed Forces were forged through months of grueling physical and mental challenges. But as Sarah walked the grounds, she began to notice details that didn't fit the image of professional military training. Graffiti on walls that contained crude sexual references, equipment that appeared to have been deliberately sabotaged, and most telling of all, the way conversations stopped whenever she walked within earshot. She made her way to the obstacle course, where a group of candidates was practicing rope climbing, under the supervision of Petty Officer First Class Danny Torres. Torres was younger than most of the other instructors, maybe 28 or 29, but he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had proven himself in combat. "Mum," Torres said as she approached, "you're the researcher, right?" "Dr. Mitchell?" "That's right. Mind if I observe for a few minutes?" "Not at all. These guys are working on speed climbing." It's one of the skills that can mean the difference between mission success and failure in the real world. Sarah positioned herself where she could watch both the candidates and Torres. The exercise seemed straightforward enough. Each candidate had to climb a 30-foot rope using only their hands and arms, no leg assistance, and complete the climb in under 2 minutes. The first several candidates completed the evolution successfully. Their technique was good, their times were acceptable, and Torres provided constructive feedback on areas for improvement. But then Johnson, the same candidate who had been singled out during PT, stepped up to the rope. "All right, Johnson," Torres said, his tone noticeably different. "Let's see if you can do something right for once." The young man grabbed the rope and began his ascent. His technique was flawless, his pace was steady, and Sarah's stopwatch showed he was well within the time limit. But as he neared the top of the rope, Torres began shouting, "Move it, Johnson! My grandmother could climb faster than that. What's wrong with you?" The verbal assault continued as Johnson completed the climb and began his descent. When he reached the ground, Torres was in his face immediately. 1 minute 47 kill. That's pathetic. You call that a climb? Get back up there and do it again. And this time, try not to embarrass yourself and this program. Tara checked her notes. The time requirement was 2 minutes. Johnson had beaten the standard by 13 seconds, yet he was being treated as if he had failed miserably. She watched as the young man climbed the rope 4 more times, each attempt faster than the last, but each one met with the same criticism from Torres. By the time Torres finally allowed him to stop, Johnson was exhausted, demoralized, and visibly shaking from the combination of physical exertion and psychological stress. After the evolution ended and the candidates were dismissed for chow, Sarah approached Torres. "That was interesting," she said carefully. "I noticed Johnson seemed to be having some difficulties." Torres shrugged. "Some guys just don't have what it takes. Johnson's been struggling since day one. Maybe it would be better for everyone if he rang out and tried something else. His times look pretty good to me." Sarah said, consulting her notebook. Well within standards. Standards are just the minimum, Doc. We're not looking for guys who can meet the minimum. We want the best of the best. Sarah nodded but made another note in her book. The pattern was becoming clearer. Certain candidates were being systematically targeted, subjected to impossible standards and constant harassment, designed to break their will and force them to quit. That afternoon, she was observing combat swimming training when she witnessed something that made her blood run cold. The evolution involved candidates swimming underwater for extended periods while wearing full combat equipment. It was inherently dangerous, requiring constant supervision and strict adherence to safety protocols. Johnson was in the water again, along with 5 other candidates. They were practicing combat swimmer infiltration techniques, approaching a simulated enemy shoreline while remaining completely submerged. Sarah watched through binoculars as the 6 men disappeared beneath the surface of the training pool. Senior Chief Webb was supposed to be monitoring their progress using underwater cameras and safety divers, but Sarah noticed that his attention seemed focused on everything except the pool. He was talking to another instructor, checking his phone, and generally ignoring the evolution in progress. The other 5 candidates surfaced right on schedule, gasping for air but otherwise fine. But Johnson was nowhere to be seen. Senior Chief, one of the candidates called out. Johnson didn't surface. Webb glanced over casually. He'll be up in a second. Kid's probably just trying to show off. But seconds turned into a minute, and Johnson still hadn't appeared. Sarah stood up from her position on the bleachers, her heart racing as she realized what was happening. Senior Chief, she called out, her voice carrying the authority of command despite her civilian clothes. Man in the water. Webb finally looked at the pool and seemed to realize the seriousness of the situation. Safety diver in the water, now. The next few minutes were controlled chaos as safety divers plunged into the pool to search for Johnson. Sarah found herself moving toward the pool area, her medical training taking over despite her cover identity as a civilian researcher. They found Johnson on the bottom of the pool, unconscious and tangled in his equipment. The safety divers brought him to the surface and began CPR immediately. Sarah knelt beside them, her hands moving automatically to check for vital signs, while her mind raced with the implications of what she had just witnessed. Johnson's pulse was weak but present. His breathing was shallow but steady. The medics arrived and took over, but not before Sarah had satisfied herself that the young man was going to survive. As the ambulance carried Johnson away to the base hospital, Sarah found herself face to face with Senior Chief Webb. His expression was a mixture of anger and something else she couldn't quite identify. Fear, perhaps. That was good thinking, Doc, he said, his voice carefully controlled. Having you here probably saved that kid's life. Sarah looked him directly in the eyes. How long was he underwater, Senior Chief? Webb's jaw tightened. Standard evolution time. Maybe a minute and a half. Sarah had been timing the exercise herself. Johnson had been underwater for nearly 4 minutes, well beyond the safe limits for the evolution, and Webb had been ignoring his responsibilities as safety supervisor, more interested in casual conversation than the lives of the men under his command. I see, she said quietly. Well, I'm glad everything worked out. As she walked back to collect her notes and equipment, Sarah's mind was already processing what she had observed. This wasn't just poor training or excessive standards. They ambushed her on the training ground, then discovered she was the SEAL Evaluator.